Okay,
Good.
well,
Yeah, I first got it, right? Got it. Okay. Hi, are you introducing me first before
yes, I
go?
am. Yes, I am.
Okay, all right.
Welcome to our Adult Ed program tonight. Lois Miller has been kind enough to prepare another wonderful talk for us. Last year, she talked about Frank Gehry, the architect, and Navi.
Yeah.
Uh,
Narit Lvov Packer.
yeah, that's it. A sculptor. Who we didn't know about beforehand, but we knew about afterwards, and that was great. She's also back in the day did presentations at the Temple, and also when she was a docent at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, she would be our guide when we went down there to visit. I remember you did the tour for the Van Gogh exhibit, and also Barnett Newman, I think.
Yes,
There was
yes, I did.
Yep.
Yes, I did.
So, and of course, Lois is a longtime member of Brit Hakeem, as was Bill Miller. So with that, I want to thank you, Lois. I'm going to turn this over to you and to Mark, who's driving.
Correct. Couldn't do it without him. So.
So you'll let me know when to change the slide.
Okay, so as we see, I'm going to be talking about Andy Warhol tonight. And I know a lot of us know a lot about him, but I've learned some interesting things. And the Jewish Genius series is something that most people and everyone that I've spoken to from the Art Museum and friends who are into art never heard of this. And I just came across it about 2 months ago. So I thought it was very interesting. And even now, there's still debate swirling around it. I will tell you about some of the critiques of it, which were interesting at the time, especially from the New York Times and the Inquirer. And even today, it still has a lot of interesting responses to it. So Mark, you can put the first slide up. Just thought I would show a photograph of Andy Warhol standing in front of one of his silk screens. And by the way, I did go online and there's a great basic YouTube of how Warhol did his silk screens. So it was interesting just to see the process, from kind of soup to nuts. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to give you a good bit of background on him because he was really a fascinating person. Had an interesting life, of course, some areas that were kind of troubling for him. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. So Warhol was born in 1928, and he was an American visual artist, film director, producer, who was a leading figure in the visual art movement known as pop art. His works explore the relationship between artistic expression, advertising, and celebrity culture that flourished in the 60s and span a variety of media, including painting, silk screening, which we will see a lot of tonight, photography, film, and sculpture. He was born and raised in Pittsburgh, and he initially pursued a successful career as a commercial illustrator. And after exhibiting his work in several galleries in the late 50s, he began to receive recognition as an influential and controversial artist. His New York studio, called The Factory, became a well-known gathering place that brought together distinguished intellectuals, drag queens, playwrights, bohemian street people, Hollywood celebrities, and wealthy patrons. He promoted a collection of personalities known as Warhol superstars and is credited with inspiring the widely used expression, 15 minutes of fame. In the late 60s, he managed and produced an experimental rock band called the Velvet Underground, and he founded a magazine called Interview. He authored numerous books, and he lived openly as a gay man before the gay liberation movement. In 1968, he was almost killed by someone who got inside his studio and shot him. Fortunately, as we know, he survived that. He has been the subject of numerous retrospective exhibitions, books, and feature and documentary films. There was one recently on Netflix. The Andy Warhol Museum in his native city of Pittsburgh has an extensive permanent collection of art and archives, and it's the largest museum in the United States dedicated to a single artist. Warhol has been described as the bellwether of the art market. Many of his creations are very collectible and highly valuable. Okay, Mark, go on to the second one so we can see another slide of him. I thought this was interesting. So here we have a silk screen of him that kind of looks, and I thought of you, Mark, because it kind of looks like a kaleidoscope. So very interesting silk screen of him. As I said, his works are some of the most expensive, include some of the most expensive paintings ever sold. And in 2022, okay, Mark, go to the next one. We have, it's called Shot Sage Blue Marilyn. And this was in 1964. And in a recent auction, this sold for $195 million, which is the most expensive work of art sold at auction by an American artist. It's kind of interesting. Okay, he comes from working class parents. His parents immigrated from Austria-Hungary, which the area would today be considered northern Slovakia. His father came over first, and then, as often happened back around the turn of the last century, his mother joined him after the death of Warhol's grandfather. And his father was a coal miner. So in third grade, he had what's called, I'm not sure, I think it's Sydenham's chorea, okay? Sometimes known falsely as St. Vitus dance, but it's a nervous system disease that causes involuntary movements of the extremities, which is believed to be a complication from rheumatic fever and can cause skin pigmentation blotchiness. And at times he was confined to his bed. He drew, listened to the radio, collected pictures of movie stars, and he later described this period as very important in the development of his personality and his skill sets and preferences. After graduating from high school, his intentions were to study art education at Pitt in the hopes of becoming an art teacher. But his plans changed and he enrolled in Carnegie Institute of Technology, now Carnegie Mellon, where he studied commercial art. And during that time, Warhol joined the campus Modern Dance Club and the Beaux-Arts Society, and he served as an art director of the student magazine. Okay, next slide. Okay, Warhol's early career was dedicated to commercial and advertising art, where his first commission had been to draw shoes for Glamour magazine. Those of us of a certain age remember Glamour magazine. I know I enjoyed it when I was young. And this was in the late 1940s. He also worked for a shoe designer by the name of I. Miller. It was Israel Miller. And he, again, was a very famous, when I was young, and probably many of you, he was a very famous shoe designer. And while working in the shoe industry, Warhol developed what's called his blotted line technique, applying ink to paper and then blotting the ink while still wet, which was akin to a printmaking process on a very rudimentary level. His use of tracing paper and ink allowed him to repeat the basic image and also to create endless variations on a theme. And there's an American photographer, and I did Google him, and when you have the time, if you can handle some kind of pornographic sculpture, he's interesting. His name is John Coplands, and I'm going to quote something he said about Andy. He said, "Nobody drew shoes the way Andy did. He somehow gave each shoe a temperament of its own, a sort of slide to loose-Lautrec kind of sophistication. But the shape and the style came through accurately, and the buckle was always in the right place." And if you look at some of these shoes, you can see, how they used to be really, kind of like the epitome of style back, in the day. In the early 50s, in 52, he actually had his first solo show in New York, and the show was not well received, but about 4 years later, he was included in his first group exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So he's kind of on his way. Okay, let's go to the next image. Okay, so this is something that everyone knows, of course. In May of 1962, he was featured in an article in Time magazine with his painting, Big Campbell's Soup Can with Can Opener, which initiated his most sustained motif, the Campbell's Soup Can. Okay, that painting became Warhol's first to be shown in the museum when it was exhibited in Hartford, Connecticut in July of 1962. And then that same year, he actually had an opening at a very prestigious gallery in Los Angeles with the Campbell Soup Cans, and that marked his debut. Okay, in December of 62, New York City's Museum of Modern Art hosted a symposium on pop art, during which artists such as Warhol were attacked for capitulating to commercialism. Critics were appalled by Warhol's open acceptance of market culture, okay? And this kind of went on throughout his career. Okay, he had a second exhibition at the what's called the Stable Gallery in 1964, which, and Mark, go to the next slide, please. Okay, and this particular piece we have at our own Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Brillo soapboxes. And for the exhibition, Warhol custom ordered wooden boxes and silk screen graphics onto them. This particular sculpture Brillo box, he also did the Del Monte peach box and the Heinz tomato ketchup box, as well as the cornflakes box. And back at that time period, these would sell, depending on the size of the box, if you wanted to buy one of the boxes, they would sell for between $200 and $400. So you think about those lucky individuals who decided to pick some up back then. Okay, I have a few more slides just to show you some of the other silk screens, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So Mark, go into the next one. And there, of course, we have Jackie Kennedy, you know, at the time of the assassination of President Kennedy. And those of us who were around back then probably still remember exactly where we were. And I remember her suit and her hat. And so that's a very famous one. And then another very important figure in our day who recently passed, next slide, please, is Queen Elizabeth, because he loved celebrity and famous people, okay? Besides, he did Marilyn and Elizabeth Taylor and Muhammad Ali. This is what he really, really enjoyed doing. So now we're gonna talk to you about the Jewish geniuses. So Mark, go to the next one. Okay, so here we have them in one of their early venues. Okay, so what he did 10 portraits of Jews of the 20th century, and it was done in 1980. And these are each 40 by 40 inches, just to give you an idea. And the series was actually suggested to him by art dealer Ronald Feldman. The subjects of the portraits were subsequently chosen by Feldman after consultation with the director of the art gallery of the Jewish Community Center of Greater Washington. Okay, and the series was first shown in Rockville, Maryland, went to Miami, went out to Los Angeles, went many places in this country, and it also went to Europe as well. So before we go and look at each individual, this is my quiz. Does anybody think they can name all 10 of these Jewish geniuses? Anybody want to give it a shot? Because I didn't know all 10. Okay, okay, let's take a look. How about, the one on the upper left-hand side of the screen, picture of the young man? Anybody have an idea? Nobody?
Well, I can't play because I helped you.
You know.
All
right, anybody beside Mark have an idea who that might be? No, okay, so that's Franz Kafka. Okay, that's Kafka.
Yeah.
Next to Kafka, anybody want to take a guess? Okay, That's Gertrude Stein.
Oh,
And we will talk a little bit about her. I know a good bit about her because of being at the museum for many years. She was really into art. Okay, now lower left, he selected this particular face, not because he knew who it was, but he thought he looked like Moses. Okay, and that is Martin Buber. All
oh.
right, and of course, next to him, we all know, okay, Einstein. Okay, and the next wall, the upper left, anybody, is Brandeis. And then we have Gershwin. And of course, everybody knows the Marx Brothers
Yeah.
and Golda down below. And Sarah, as I used to call her when I was a child, Sarah Heartburn, but that's Sarah Bernhardt. Okay. And last one is a young picture of Freud. Okay. So those were the Jewish geniuses which were selected. And I'll get into a little bit later some of the other choices that were there. Okay, so I mentioned earlier that some of the critics were extremely critical in a really negative way. And Hilton Kramer at the time was the art critic for the New York Times. And in his original review, because this particular series is going to be revisited again in 2008 with more criticism, some a little better, but some not. Okay, so the Times original review by Hilton Kramer had stated that the show, and I'm quoting, the show is vulgar, it reeks of commercialism, and its contribution to art is nil. And that the way it exploits its Jewish subjects without showing the slightest grasp of their significance is offensive, or would be anyway, if the artist had not already treated so many non-Jewish subjects in the same tawdry manner. So you can see how Kramer felt about whatever Andy Warhol did, you know, was not a fan. And the Philadelphia Inquirer called the series Jewploitation, and a critic for the Village Voice wrote that the show was hypocritical, cynical, and exploitative. So these were the kinds of criticism that he got. This is kind of interesting. And as I said, it's going to be revisited, and some of the criticism does become positive. But
Did it, Lois?
yeah, yeah.
Did any of them say anything about the people he selected? Because it's such
Okay.
a
Yeah,
diverse group.
I'm going to talk a little bit about that. He really had nothing to do with the selection. I mean, he didn't know anything about Judaism. Like, I think it was his deal, or someone at the time said he didn't even say, or, you know, I want to go to like a religious service or a Shabbat dinner. You know, bottom line, you know, in his mind, it was, will it sell? And he thought that Jewish people would buy. And you know what? They did, because it gave us as a group a sense of pride to see that, you know, many of these people, as we know, you know, are to this day, you know, I mean, some of them maybe you don't remember, maybe like, you know, Sarah Bernhardt, you know, but most of these people, you know, have stood the test of time, and they are true geniuses, though she also was in her craft. From the reading I did, because I did research, you know, the people I didn't know a lot about. Like, you know, I knew she was an actress, but she has a fascinating background. If you ever have some time to just Google her, she is fascinating. But yeah, let me get into that, because I did, let me see where I did that. Okay, so just to say, back in 2008, they decided there was a show at, I believe it was at the Jewish Museum in New York, almost 30 years after the initial one appeared, and it was called Warhol's Jews, 10 Portraits Reconsidered, presents silkscreen versions, one of 5 editions of the paintings Warhol made, and several preliminary graphite drawings. Okay, so it says the exhibit returns to these pictures with a fresh set of questions. And the man who wrote the catalog, this Gertrude Meir, he says, while commercial success was central to Warhol, a Catholic who otherwise showed little interest in Jewish culture. Meir suggests there was more behind his series of Jews than simply a desire to sell. Inspiration for the series came not from Warhol, but from his friend, the art dealer Ronald Feldman, one of many Jews in the art world that Warhol did befriend. Feldman and an Israeli art dealer by the name of Alexander Harari suggested the series of Jews as an outgrowth of an earlier print of Golda Meir, because he had been asked earlier before this to do a print, and he did do another print earlier of Golda, and then of course she's included in this as well. Okay, so to your question, a list of almost 100 Jews was first put forth, and that list originally included people like Bob Dylan, Karl Marx, and even a few non-Jews, and it was finally kind of, pared down, whittled down to the 10 you see up here. And according to Warhol, who was famously evasive when it came to explaining his decision, he said the selection process was largely determined by the faces he liked best. Like as I said a little while ago, Martin Buber reminded him of Moses. He liked that face. So that's why he selected that. Okay. And again, Kramer had said, the art critic had said that Warhol's art belongs less to the history of painting than to the history of publicity, okay? But almost 3 decades later, much has changed. And Warhol, contrary to some predictions, has proved his staying power. Critics failed to recognize what the crowds already knew. Warhol captured something irresistible about the zeitgeist of American culture in the 70s. It was statements like "they're going to sell," a reference to the portrait of Jews taken from Warhol's diary, that led people to believe that his only motivation was financial. But Warhol understood marketing as central to the meaning and mission of his work, all of which was made to sell. He asked people to think of his paintings as mirrors, and he was perhaps the most brilliant mirror of his time. Now, the director of the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, in a lecture, said that he was talking to a group of older Jewish people, and he said to them, "Things aren't always as they seem. The series of portraits," let me say this. Many viewed the series of the 10 Jews as an extension of other portraits that he had done earlier, brushing them off as empty consumerist art, whose only reason was to increase his coffers. But now, it was 28 years later, you find, critics are saying, here you find a richness and depth of culture that he didn't find in the other people he portrayed. And interestingly enough, Jewish communities around the country welcomed the series of portraits with far greater enthusiasm than the critics. Throughout the early 80s, when it first toured Jewish community centers and regional museums, where it elicited a sense of cultural affirmations and ethnic and religious pride. Now, almost 30 years later, as I said earlier, Warhol was said not to know who Martin Buber was before he appeared on the list, and we know why he chose him. But he had a long relationship with Jewish dealers, curators, collectors, and the like. So whether reflective of a broader change in attitude to this series of portraits, or merely the perspective of the curator, the 2008 Warhol's use rejects the idea that exploitation was the sole motivation behind the series, okay? So they're kind of, being kinder to him, more gentle to him. So we'll get into a little more detail about these Jewish geniuses. Just to tell you basically what he did. He started out, and you can really see it maybe in Kafka's Silkscreen, and probably Brandeis and Gershwin. Each of them, he started out with a photograph. he enlarged it. Then he affixed scraps of colored paper and added his own line drawings to the subject's faces. And then he silk screened the results. Let's see what else. Okay. I think that's okay. So that's as far as, a couple other interesting things. In creating his 10 Jews, whom he frequently characterized as Jewish geniuses, he does admit that his primary motive was financial. He had been saturating the market with tens of thousands of reproductions and prints, almost all of which featured less than serious subjects, and his popularity had deteriorated. Whether or not he purposefully turned to serious subjects as a means to rehabilitate his reputation, the 10 Jews project presented these, really icons of our modern day, all of whom embodied significant cultural change. So that's kind of how it was received. And let's get into looking at them a little closer. And as I say, of course, I've heard of Franz Kafka, but I had never read anything. And I did find out that he was actually a lawyer, but he really didn't pursue his craft. And he became an author and a novelist. And again, he had a very troubled, short life. He lived between born in 1883, died in 1924, and often tortured by a lot of things. And maybe I'll find that, Mark, when I read Metamorphosis. You said you and Rhonda read it.
But he, he was bothered by war and things like that. I mean,
yeah, he had.
I read some in the original German in my German class. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's going to be my summer reading, just to see what.
Yeah.
I read a few that quite a long time ago, though. Metamorphosis and The Trial and The Castle.
Okay. Yeah. No,
I just remember they were all really interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So Gertrude Stein, and she lived.
Do you want me to move forward in the slides or not yet?
Yeah, you know what? Right, because we'll see them up close and personal. Okay. So I have a bigger slide of Kafka, the same one, just a little larger. So yeah, move forward.
Okay. Oh, there we go.
Yeah. So here's a bigger silk screen of him, and okay. So and you can really see kind of like the patches of colored paper that he used and the line drawing. You see, especially around the hairline and the ear, what Warhol added. How he. And the eyebrow. So it's interesting what he did. Okay, so the next one is Gertrude Stein. And she was part of a well-to-do Jewish family. And of course, you've heard a lot about her. I Love You, Alice B. Toklas. There's lots of things. But she and her brother lived in Paris for several years. They lived together, and they actually had salons every week. And the most famous today, every well-known author that we know, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, people like Picasso, Matisse, they would attend her salons. So that's Gertrude Stein. And also she said, a rose is a rose is a rose. That was Gertrude Stein. And there is no there. That's also Gertrude Stein. But again, a very interesting figure. Okay. And, her relationship with Alice B. Toklas. So as I say, when I was researching her, it was fascinating and something you should look into. Now we'll look at our kind of Moses lookalike, Martin Buber, or so Andy Warhol says. And he lived between 1878 and 1965. And again, I never had philosophy in college, so I had heard of him, but I never studied him. But he was a philosopher, and he's famous for his dialogue called the I-thou relationship. And he wasn't religious, but Zionism was important to him. And, Judaism was important to him, but he, he was not a religious person. Okay, next one we have, of course, is our all-time, probably favorite of all time. We have Einstein. And of course, what can I say? Theory of relativity, and it goes on and on and on. So he had to be included. But again, you can actually, in this one really well, you can see kind of like the line drawings that Warhol, did to this photograph. He really kind of transformed this one. And then next one we have is Lois Brandeis, okay, the Supreme Court Justice. And again, he lived between 1856 and 1941. And he's known for the right to privacy, and something that's kind of fitting right now. He criticized the power of large banks and corporations. He was very Zionistic. Okay, so of course we know he was a lawyer, of course, and social justice was very important to him, freedom of speech. So, issues that we're facing right now as we speak. And again, this one's interesting, the color pieces of paper that he used, I just find very interesting here, and how he kind of cut off the ear, making that blue versus the rest of the face. It's kind of interesting what was done there. Okay, so next we have George Gershwin. And of course, we're all familiar with him, with, Rhapsody in Blue and Porgy and Bess, and, so many wonderful things, American in Paris. And interestingly enough, Gershwin was also an artist in his own right. And I remember a few years ago, more than a few years ago, I was up late and I was watching a movie about him. I don't remember who played him. His girlfriend was Alexis Smith, but I don't remember who played Gershwin. But I remember he was meeting her at an art gallery, and in the window of the art gallery, there was a painting by Amadeo, and as we say, Modigliani, although I was called on the carpet by an Italian person many years ago that I shouldn't have to call him Modigliani, but anyway. So and the funny thing was that particular painting in the movie had just been in a show at the art museum, which I thought was fascinating. It's an interesting world. So that is Gershwin. He died very young from a brain tumor. He only lived between 1898 and 1937. And again, the line drawings is kind of very interesting. You see that, the kind of like almost like a modern art feel to the upper left-hand area, and then kind of like just the kind of etching areas in his jacket and his hair. And the eyebrows are kind of interesting as well, what Warhol did. So next, going on, we have Golda Meir. And of course, we all know Golda, and she lived from 1898 to 1978, was actually our fourth prime minister of Israel. And she actually migrated to Israel in 1921. And she was one of the signers of the original Declaration of independence, that Israeli independence. She signed it. And okay.
Could I say something?
Yeah, of course.
So Mark and I were watching a webinar about Golda Meir. This was on Sunday.
Yeah.
And they showed this. And Mark
Did
goes,
they?
Yeah, Mark says,
Mark,
that's going to be in Lois's
I know
presentation.
that, right? Yeah. Well, this is what he did. He was commissioned to do this first. His art dealer had him, met with the dealer in Israel, and he did Golda first, and then came the series of the Jewish geniuses. But yeah, there she is. And then next, of course, we talked about earlier is Sarah Bernhardt, and she also had a very interesting life. She lived between 1844 and 1923, and she was probably the most famous stage actress of the time. And she wasn't a legitimate child. It's interesting. I mean, she had a rough life. In the beginning, her mom was a courtesan, and her father was a lawyer, and she was, as I say, a very famous actress. And at one point, later on in her career, she had an illness and she had to have her leg amputated. So that didn't stop her, though. She still acted, and she made sure that for the most part, she was seated. And of course, you could wear long skirts back then, you weren't looked at as an oddity. And she continued acting through it all. She was really, she was like, a feminist way, way, way ahead of her time. So she was a fascinating read when I was researching her. And lastly, or next to last, we have, of course, Sigmund Freud. I actually didn't recognize this initially because I don't think I'd ever seen a photograph of him at this age. I remember him a little older than this. And of course, the father of psychoanalysis. And our last are the Marx brothers. And we have, so it's Harpo, Groucho, and Chico. And you probably know the reason how Harpo got his nickname is because he was the brother who played the harp beautifully. I remember in some of the old movies, when you watch the Marx Brothers, they would have him in a scene playing the harp, and that's how Harpo got his name. And they said Chico was an excellent pianist. So again, these, although often their movies were extremely silly because they were comedic actors, they were extremely, extremely talented. And their mother, Minnie, she was in vaudeville. So, they came by this kind of, from the womb almost. And interestingly enough, I went to a Hadassah meeting down here last week, and the speaker was a professor of English at one of the universities down here. And the topic was Mark Twain. And at the end of his talk, he often when I do when I used to do a Jewish connection tour at the museum, I always used, and I think I used it with you guys too, that one, well, it's a very wordy quote, a very verbose quote, as Mark Twain was known to be, but he ended with the same quote, talking about how wonderful the Jew, as a group, Jews are, and how, talked about our intelligence. And it was just, it kind of did your heart good. And the other thing I learned about Mark Twain, my son knew this, I did not know this, and maybe you do. Anybody other than Scotty know how Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, got the name Mark Twain? No.
It has to do with the depth of the water.
You got it.
It's real,
Ding, ding,
right?
ding. Rhonda got it right. It had to do with, they would, I think they said each fathom was 6 feet, and they marked the fathoms. So the mark, and then Twain, instead of saying two, Twain was another way to say two. Because, he was a riverboat pilot. That was one of his, his many jobs. So that was Mark Twain. So that was very interesting. So I hope I've, given you some food for thought and some, something to do over the summer, or when you have some free time, Google some of these people and learn more about them. And, if anybody has any comments, questions, whatever.
One of the things I find really interesting is, in the 20th century, you're seeing some art that's really well received that are just squares and rectangles of colors. And here he's combining these rectangles of colors with
Right.
photographs.
But I think, it's just as I say, when he was doing it, when you think, I guess, especially maybe back, 50, 60 years ago, when you think about art, you think about the great artists that we see in the museums, but like you were saying earlier, some of the shows I did, Van Gogh, when Van Gogh was painting, he was basically a starving artist. So many of them were, and they were only kind of received, got their due, unfortunately, after they died. You mentioned Barnett Newman, the same kind of thing. People back then didn't understand it. Today, Barnett Newman probably, if he was young today and exhibiting, probably would be a completely different thing. But yeah, it's how tastes change. So it is interesting. It happens.
Yeah, and I have trouble appreciating the art that's like Barnett Newman, that's blocks of color, but when you put the blocks of color on top of something else, so to me it makes it exciting. I liked it.
That's why I even enjoyed looking at that. It was a real elementary kind of silkscreen that's on YouTube. The man who did it, the artist who did it, I mean, started from scratch literally, and he had the image of like a fish. So you basically just saw the bones. You know, it was a stylized fish that had been, you know, de-skinned. There was no skin. And then he did that image, did the blocks of color, superimposed the fish on the blocks of color. And it was fascinating to watch it. You know, it would be like, you know, a great art project for somebody who's, you know, somewhat into that. I wouldn't attempt it, but it was really interesting watching it. Yeah. Yeah, I know. So I want to thank you all very much for spending some time with me tonight. And
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so
Chicago.
much.
Thank you, Lois.
you're welcome.
Thank you,
You're
Lois. It's
welcome.
very, very good, very interesting.
Yeah.
Good. Glad you enjoyed it.